So, good evening, everybody. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture that brings you this program, the Parent Education Series, now in its 18th year. We are honored and delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Donald Grant, who is going to be talking to you about a very important subject, how to navigate difficult conversations with your kids. Your parents, I know you never have difficult conversations with your kids, but I have, and Donald has. So we thought this would be a good topic for tonight.
Thank you so much, Charlene. And Charlene and Bev, thank you for all the wonderful work that you all are doing in the community to ensure that parents have the opportunity to gain access to resources and to really dig in on some of the things that really bring us well, that keep us up at night sometimes. And so, when we had our discussion today, when we had our discussion about planning for today, having the opportunity to really chat with parents and talk to them and answer their questions surrounding having these very difficult conversations, I think having the conversation with parents about having the conversation is really difficult. And so I'd like to start off kind of just laying the foundation, laying the groundwork of kind of where we're going to go today. What we're going to do is we're going to first look at ourselves as parents. One of the things that people minimize is the fact that our role as a human being navigating the world in our own sense of self can be challenging. And what that results in is challenges in our different relationships. Well, one of those relationships are with our children. And one of the challenges we have with that is our own stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is really walk through what it means to be mindful about yourself, mindful about your own experiences and the challenges that you may have with having difficult conversations. Because if you have trouble managing difficult conversations with adults, that's just going to spill out into having difficult time managing them with your children. The next piece is looking at children and understanding what they need and being open to being able to give them those tools that they need to thrive so that they can be communicators that are not afraid of having difficult conversations and engaging in dialogue that can be tough sometimes. The final piece we're going to look at is what do we understand about child development and how do we understand the ability to share very, very tough themes, the exact same themes across different developmental stages, meaning that there aren't many topics that are inappropriate for any verbal child. But there are some ways that we can share that are inappropriate. And so we're going to pay attention to those things. I really encourage you to put any questions that you have into the Q&A as we go along. I'm open to answering questions and being a thought partner as we move through the presentation. So you don't have to feel compelled to wait until we get to the very end to ask those questions. So the first thing that we need to understand is what a difficult conversation is made up of. We understand that a difficult conversation is made up of three different parts. Three different parts. The first part of a difficult conversation is the what happened part. The second part of the difficult conversation is the emotional part. The third part of the difficult conversation is the identity part. So that's three parts: the what happened part, the emotional part, and the identity part. So when we're having difficult conversations in general, oftentimes we're not always able to come to consensus on actually what happened. The facts may be seen in different ways, and we know that even when we talk to judges and lawyers and police officers, we understand that eyewitness testimony can be very, very unreliable. So that demonstrates that in some of our most difficult times, we may not actually recall the event exactly like it happened. So the what happened conversation can always be a little bit challenging, but it is the easiest part of a difficult conversation when we talk about the three parts. Remember, what happened, emotion, identity. And so when we look at the what happened part, many of us get stuck there because we have so much anxiety associated with approaching the identity and the emotional part. And so many of us get stuck in the weeds about what actually happened. Did this happen? Did that happen? What part of it happened? How did it happen? What did it look like? And so once we're able to get kind of past those things, we're then able to delve into the emotional part. How did it make us feel? I once heard someone say, having children is like watching your heart walk around outside of your body. And for me, even before I was a dad, that analogy resonated like, wow. And then when I became a dad 14 years ago, it blew my mind as to how true that actually felt. And so when we're talking about difficult conversations with our children, we have the emotions that we hold for ourselves and the emotions that we hold for our children. Many of us are afraid of quote unquote taking the innocence of our children away, making it such that they're seeing the world in a way that we don't believe they see it. Here's the truth of the matter here's the truth of the matter is that many of our children have been exposed to many of the things that we're trying to keep them from. I've given an analogy before when my son first learned about, and I posted right here, when my son first learned about the assassination of Dr. King, and we had celebrated the holiday. He knew that he was a great man. We had been to the memorial in Washington, D.C. when he was a little older than a toddler. But then we was in first grade, I think it was. He found out that Dr. King didn't just die, that he was murdered. And in my mind, I thought he was too young for that explanation. But then I realized with the magnitude of the things that were surrounding him, he had been exposed to that construct before, hate so big that it could hurt someone, harm someone, or actually lead to their death. I realized in retrospect, obviously, that my challenge with that conversation having happened sooner than I thought it should was because I was emotional about a part of my child's youth that may have been being taken away from him. When I realized that that wasn't the case, I became more open to exploring how to discuss difficult topics with him. Now, the concern, though, is with our emotional well being. Many of us haven't positioned ourselves in a space to be authentic with how the world impacts our emotions and some of the difficult things that we see, some of the difficult content that we consume, some of the difficult experiences that we've had. We haven't done our due diligence to walk through them. I read an article recently, and the article was, in fact, I kept it up right for right now. The article was entitled, or is entitled, let's see, what is it? Oh, I pulled it up and left. I'll find it soon. The article, the gist of the article is asking parents to light up and smile every time their child walks into a room. Every time your child walks into a room, I'm going to share a quote from this article. Every time your child walks into a room, it says, make sure your face lights up whenever your child enters a room. And it's on the Good Men Project. And I'll put the link in the chat box. And what this article begins to talk about is the author having an emotionally absent parent and their inability to connect with them in the ways that supported them, made them feel seen and valued and heard. Now, granted, I'm not suggesting that a parent's mental health and well-being has to be optimal in order to parent well, because that's never the case for any of us parents, because things are so difficult. But what I do know is when I read this article and realized that my face did not light up every time my child walked into the room, I realized that there were some adjustments that I could make. And I realized that impacted his comfort, his safety, and his capacity to come to me when there was a difficult conversation to be had. When you think about the analogy that all of us are sick of, on an airplane, before you help someone else with their oxygen mask, what should you do? I know I can't hear you, but I'm hoping everybody is saying simultaneously, put on your mask first. It's an overused analogy, but it's overused for a reason because it makes so much sense and it has so many practical purposes. The reason I'm spending so much time on this emotional part of the difficult conversation is because many of us as parents, we don't recognize ourselves in the center of these difficult conversations. And us recognizing our emotions allows us to decenter ourselves and center our children inside of a difficult conversation. when we're dealing with the historical traumas of our childhood, of our parents, of bullies in school that we had, of heartbreak, of divorce, of parental death, of all these different things, it's hard for us to show up in a way that curates an environment, a container where your child can be safe enough with you to have these difficult conversations. Now, does that mean that you have to say, well, I just have to go to, 3 months of therapy before I can talk to my child? It's not what I'm saying at all. But I am suggesting that perhaps you meditate for 10 minutes before you open a difficult conversation with your child. Maybe you do an hour of yoga before you open up a challenging conversation with your child. Maybe you go for a walk. Sometimes we underestimate the things that we bring into these conversations with our children. And remember, our children know us very well, much better than we think they do. And they can read the signs and symbols. And so as we approach and understand difficult conversations, our own emotional well-being up on entry into those conversations is a critical factor on how this conversation is going to go, how the tenor is going to be, and what the texture of additions that they bring to it will be. Now, the last piece of a difficult conversation is the identity piece. The identity piece states that when we are in a difficult conversation, oftentimes we are feeling like we are taking on the identity of whatever stance we are or are not taking in this conversation. And so, for instance, let's say during the height of the Asian American and AAPI violence here in the United States, and I realize that although the AAPI violence is now being overshadowed by many other things, I realize that it's still happening, that it's still a major and significant problem. And so, when we were looking at those events happening and we were trying to make it make sense to our children, whether you're a member of that community or not. And you would look at the ideologies of the individuals who were engaging in the violence and who were survivors and victims of the violence. And you would try to help a child understand the nature of our world that was making this possible. Well, you have individuals who were who were participating in those conversations who may have been giving off some significant anti-Asian American rhetoric or language. And when you approach them with it, their immediate thought was, "Oh, you think I'm racist, or you think I am anti-Asian, or you think I'm xenophobic." When the reality is, that was the identity part of a difficult conversation showing its face. That was the difficult part. That was the identity part, excuse me, of the difficult conversation surfacing in a way that makes it almost intolerable to engage in. When we have conversations with our children, a piece of our identity is being shown and questioned sometimes. And you have to, as an adult, be able to navigate, who are you in this conversation? What do you stand for in this conversation? What does this conversation say about you as a parent? What does it say about you in relationship to your child and your family? And what does it say about you and the expectations you have for your child? Now, I am no master at difficult conversations, but what I did do about 8 years ago or 7 years ago, I filmed a conversation with my son having a difficult conversation so that I could work to help other parents see what this may look like and feel what this may look like. And so, what I want to do now is just share a small clip of it. And then later on, based on another part, I'm going to share another clip. But this is a great way for me to model to you what it might look like to open up a dialogue with a difficult conversation with your child. Now, this particular video was shot, I believe, shortly. So maybe it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't 7 or 8 years ago. This was shot shortly after the murder of George Floyd. And my son was young, but I needed him to understand the nature of what was happening. And so we decided to shoot these videos. I want you to observe how I spoke to him. I want you to observe how I allowed him to step into some pitfalls. I want you to observe how I redirected him and how I gave him confidence to be able to say what was on his mind from his perspective. And so I'm going to share this now and we'll have some discussion on the back end.
There's a lot of things going on. So I wanted to talk to you tonight about racism and kind of what racism is and what you know about it. If you have any questions and things like that. I'm recording this because I told you that I wanted other parents to be able to have an opportunity to talk with their kids and kind of use our conversation maybe as a model. And so I think that's a cool idea.
Yeah.
Cool. So, what do you know about racism? What do you know about racism?
Well, it is it is most as far as I know, it is more common for people to know about it on Black people, even though it is equally as bad as people who are Latino, people who are Asian,
Okay.
many different races. And so I know that people discriminate.
What does that mean?
Discrimination is kind of, how do I say it? Something that, well, they just say how some they judge them before even knowing who they are.
Okay. That's prejudice, right? And so discrimination is when I treat you a different way. And so I think that's a great
Edit that out.
description. No, it's fine. It's fine. No, it can stand. Everybody's learning, so we don't have to edit anything out, right?
Is that I'm on mute. The first thing, if you notice in the video, is that we want to seek out the information that the child already knows. We want to ask them what they know about the topic that we're speaking of, whether we're talking about death, mourning, grief, whether we're talking about racism, sexual assault, whether we're talking about different lifestyles in different communities. We want to ask the child what they know first. Now, remember, this is after you've already done your yoga, taking your walk, gotten yourself in the space to have this conversation because it's going to be challenging. I don't know if you noticed, but I had my knee brace on. So I think I had just come from a walk or a jog when we were doing this. And so you want to find out what your child knows. You want to find out what information they already have. You may even want to find out where they got some of the information that they got. You want to understand how much information they have, how many tools they already have, how many questions they might have, different things that they say that may be a little bit solid or a little bit off. We want to be able to address. Now, this is not an easy conversation. So when I think about the 3 stages of difficult conversations that I shared with you all, I'm just going to walk you through how those fit inside this conversation with my son. The what happened piece of this conversation is that he, at this young age, was being exposed to images of anti-Black racism in a very significant way. He was seeing the events happen around the world, and it was not anything that we were willing or interested or could in any way hide from him. In the same way that so many things that you all are seeing right now in the world, there's a certain age by which our kids are going to see them, no matter how hard we try not to expose them to. So the what happened piece allowed us to open up from what he has seen in the world and provide him with a developmentally appropriate stage to understand what happened. Now, if we're talking about a child who is, say, under the age of 6 and they are seeing things, it may not be necessary to share with them every single detail of what happened, obviously. In some event that you're speaking about, or some world activity. And right now all of us are working with our kids and helping them understand the war in the Middle East and what that means and the history behind that, and understanding what's happening with that. And for my son, he's in high school, he's 14. He's learning about the death and the destruction and the humanitarian issues and the history, and all the things. However, if a kid was 6 and you can't hide them from it necessarily, let's say they've already been exposed to it, how do you identify how to explain war to a 6-year-old? How do you identify how to explain racial intolerance to a 6-year-old? These are all things that we work together to develop frameworks to be able to do, understanding that the curiosity of a child converts to their emotional intelligence. And if we don't honor their curiosity authentically, we actually have the capacity to handicap and halt their socio-emotional development. And we don't want to do that. And so finding these ways to have these conversations is really critical. So the what happened piece of this conversation was not the most challenging piece. I will say the emotion and the identity components were challenging for me, because what I'm watching me as a Black man talk about the murders of other Black men to my Black son. And as a dad, I'm dealing with the intergenerational trauma associated with what I grew up seeing in this space. And then I'm also having the emotional fear that he will one day be in danger of this space that I'm talking about. That makes the conversation even more difficult when we're talking about identity and emotion and what all those things mean. So now the question is, how do you as a parent determine what's developmentally appropriate for your child to explore? How do you understand better and make decisions and determinations on what it is they hear, what it is they see, and what it is they know? Well, the first step to that is having the conversation with them, being able to open up the dialogue and understand what it is they need to know. And so when I think about this conversation with my son, I'm moving it to the second part that I want you all to see. So we talked about, the difficulty with ambiguity inside of a conversation. And for me, it was really important that he understood the value and the nuances associated with structural racism. And so when we're talking about developmental stages, I chose to create some nuance in our conversation as it related to understanding the differences in anti-Blackness.
Interesting, interesting. And so that's true, but what's not true is that racism does happen to Black people more. And so let's talk about why that is. You didn't think that before right now, right? You thought
No,
that
I did not.
Asian Americans and Latinx Americans, you thought they all experienced racism at a similar rate as Black people do.
Yeah, I did actually.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people try to make that argument, but it's not true. In America, Black people experience a great deal more racism than a lot of other people. Right now, we know that there's something really big happening in America right now, and it's from this guy being murdered. Let's talk about that for a little bit. His name was George Floyd. What do you know about him being murdered?
Well, what I do know is he was a dad. He was a father. He had a wife. And he had children.
Yeah, he had 2 children.
Right. And a police officer was on his neck. Um, I personally don't exactly.
So when I asked him about the differences in the experiences with racism, I just want everybody to understand. I don't know if you were able to read that. I indicated, and he and I, there's two other parts to that video, indicated that every person of color experiences often, every person of color is in danger of experiencing racism without question. But then we went into the levels of over incarceration, the police violence, all the different things that demonstrate these specific instances where he is in more danger across the lifespan when compared to other groups. Now, for some kids, that's not developmentally appropriate to begin discussing. When you saw me ask him about George Floyd specifically and what happened, for a kid under 10, under 12, that's not a conversation that you're going to have. But in this instance, because my kid is a member of the group that is in danger of these things, I may have to expand my conversation a little bit more beyond his development. It's the same way that parents of girl children have to speak to them about sexual assault in a different way at an earlier stage than many of us who are parents of boys have to. Now, do I understand that boys and men are survivors of sexual assault as well? I do. But we know that there are women who are disproportionately represented in this space. And so when we understand that, we know that a parent is going to have to tell a girl different things about staying safe. And in order to do that, they're gonna have to talk about anatomy in a way that I may not quite talk to my son about at that stage. And so when we talk about developmental stages, it's not one size fits all, that your child is like 7 years old now, and suddenly you can say this. If they're a member of a group, you may have to expand your ability to explain certain things. I do a lot of work with different independent private schools across the state of California, and I was working with one school, and they had a fourth grader who was transitioning gender. They were going to get gender affirmation surgery in middle school, but their parents, they were allowing them to transition socially while they were at this stage. And so I was brought into the school to help the teachers come up with ways and ideas to have discussions with children of this age, because they presumed that third graders were not able to have a conversation about what it means to be transgender. Now, it is very difficult to do, and it is very challenging to dig into, but there are ways to do it. And so what we did was we developed a framework for science teachers to open up discussions about different organisms that oscillate between gender throughout their lifespan. Those include seahorses, all sorts of plants. There are certain types of insects and spiders that all have this ability to oscillate between genders across the lifespan. That opened up the children in an age appropriate way to the understanding of gender flexibility, gender fluidity, something that adults feel like children of that age are not ready to talk about. Why? Because remember, in difficult conversations, there's three different parts. And when we talk about the identity piece, most of us feel like when you talk about transgender or anything surrounding the LGBTQ plus community, that it's always about sex and intercourse. And we have to realize that's what we've been conditioned to believe. Because of the stereotypes that we have about the LGBTQ plus community, those conversations are difficult because we're assigning the identity that we have with all the anti-gay rhetoric around us. It's impacting how we see it, and we don't even realize you can talk about the LGBTQ plus community without once mentioning sex, without once mentioning intercourse, without once talking about anybody's genitalia. But how do you develop the identity and the emotional intelligence to figure out that there's a road to do that in, to understand that there is a way to engage in that conversation that's developmentally appropriate, but that takes your fear and your anxiety out of it, that allows you to even learn as you prepare to have the conversation. Charlene, I just wanted to pause for a second to see if there were any questions that anybody had as we're moving along.
Yeah, and thank you, Donald. People are really appreciating this framework, this scaffolding that you're giving us to have these
Good.
So here's a really excellent question. Writer asks, please talk about how to talk about death to our kids. We have a 4-year-old daughter and we recently lost our dog.
Oh, that's a tough one. So we had to put our dog down about 5 years ago. And, I didn't grow up with a pet. And I remember it being so much more challenging than I thought it was going to be. We had the dog for 12 years. She was a beautiful little chug. That's a Chihuahua pug. We had gotten her right before my son was born, just so me and my wife could make sure that, we could come home on time and whatever we had to do to take care of something other than ourselves and our plant. And so our son by this time was maybe 11, and the dog was getting sick, and we took her to the vet, and the vet said, you got a couple of weeks. They said the tumor that was growing was too large, and it was all kind of mixed up, and she was such a tiny dog that they said surgery would not necessarily fix it. So they said, you take her home for a week or so, you're gonna have to bring her back, we're gonna have to put her down. And I said, wow. And of course, my family just sent me in. They just said, okay, you go do it. And I cried. I was really surprised I had the emotions that I did. But when we had to talk about death to our son before that, when he lost a grandparent, it was a difficult conversation because attending to our own stuff, remember, we bring ourselves into every conversation we're a part of. And so the first thing is clearing out everything that's going to negatively impact your ability to have the conversation. And part of taking that out is sometimes naming them and saying, you know what, I'm feeling really emotional about this as I talk to you about it because I'm hurt too. We acknowledge to our children that we too have feelings and experiences that are not always easy, even though we try to show up all put together. A part of our child's ability to understand their own social emotional intelligence is our ability to show vulnerability in front of them, our ability to show them that we don't always have all the answers. Some of us tend to just make things up, and we even sometimes tell lies to our kids until we can figure it out. That's not a good look. It always lands in a place where our child will not trust us to be there to help them, support them, assess them fairly, provide them with details about their lives that are going to make them better. And so when we think about death, one of the things about death that puts it in a unique category is that it's so finite. Many of the other things we can talk about that are difficult, many of them kind of have an ebb and a flow to them. Sometimes it's going to be this hard, and other times it's not going to be this hard. Or like divorce, for instance. Like divorce is a construct that we can help kids get through in a way that says, it's real tough right now, but we're able to put in systems that help us feel better along the way. And once we are able to co-parent in this way, and once we get this settled, these things will feel a little bit better. But death is finite. It's hard to convince a child in that moment when they know there's nothing that can happen to bring that loved one, pet, family member, whatever it is, no one that can bring them back. That's a tough situation. And so what we want to do is make sure we help them understand that even when things can't change, it doesn't mean that your feelings can't change. Remember that. Even when the outcome of the event can't be changed, it doesn't mean that your feelings surrounding that event can't be changed. Now, another thing about death is that we don't always talk about grief and mourning as two things together. Grief and mourning are a significant part of death. And what we oftentimes do, at least what people from my generation were taught to do, they were taught to, get over it as fast as you can, just move on. You don't have the space to mourn, you don't have the space to feel grief. Well, here's the thing. We want to provide our children with space to mourn, space to grieve. Even if we're like, oh, dude, you only had the dog for like 2 years. Are you really seriously this broken up over it? Like, that may be your internal narrative, right? But there may be things that your child is dealing with. Now, the last piece about death that's really important to focus on is identifying what your child feels like they may have lost as a result of this particular entity no longer being a part of their world. Remember, a pet, a person, whatever it may be. What does your child think that they're losing as a result of the absence of that? And the goal is to say, wow, I get the importance, I get and understand where you sit. And guess what? There may be ways where you can get some of those things in a way that come from a different space, where that wasn't the only source of, your funniest moments. That wasn't the only source of your intimacy. That wasn't the only source of your joy. Not minimizing what that person or pet brought to that your child's world, but helping them see that there's so many places where they can access joy, happiness, connectivity, intimacy. And what we then do by proxy is we increase what we call their external locus of control. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with that term, we have an internal locus of control and an external locus of control. And that's LOCUS, internal and external. And the caps lock was on, so I apologize. That looks like IOCUS, but that's really just a lowercase l with an OCUS, locus of control. When we help children look to their environment and understand that they have this agency to identify so many sources of self-actualization, we provide them with a sense that they can have a play, have a say in how they feel in the world, how they move about the world, what can make them happy and what can make them sad. And then all of their eggs are not in one basket. It's kind of like when you have a teenager and they have a fight with a friend and they just think this was their best friend and it was their entire world. And suddenly nothing's going to matter anymore because this friend is gone. We never want our children or ourselves to have reliance upon one single factor to drive our happiness. This is one reason why we see, for instance, the number of unhoused teenagers across the state, across the country. Many of them are members of the LGBTQ plus community because their parents, who may be homophobic, are unable to mourn and grieve for the vision that they had of who their child would be as opposed to who they are. And as a result, the anxiety was too heavy to problem solve, to engage in the difficult conversation, to process what their identity was being, how their identity was being implicated in this difficult conversation. And as a result, they sever ties. If those parents were able to sustain that difficult conversation, things may look differently. If they were able to access the what happened, the emotion, and the identity in a healthy way, there may have been a different outcome. This plays out for so many situations across the lifespan of our children. And remember, our children are still adolescents up through age 25, which neuroscience demonstrates is the moment at which our brains stop developing. And so when we're having these conversations, some of you may have a 17-year-old or a 19-year-old. These conversations, these tools that we're discussing today are still valuable and important for those spaces as well. I'm going to share my screen one more time just to share a little bit more of the second part of the video. And so one of the things that we oftentimes miss doing is sharing the explanation of a system. And so this piece was was looking at how racism worked. And I wanted him just not to understand that this was a thing. This is a next level of understanding, again, depending on the developmental stage of your child. But we also want them not to just know what happened, but why our systems why our systems in many ways like they are. How do we find ourselves inside certain spaces? And so I'll just share a brief clip of this.
It's the question, you don't know what George Floyd did. What I'm trying to illustrate is that I don't know if it matters what he did. And here's the concern. When we talk about the distribution of racism, like who gets what, let's say we ordered a pizza and it was a pizza and it had 10 slices and we were to split that pizza up. And let's say if pizza was racism and we were giving pieces of racism to people, it'd be likely that if we had a multicultural group sitting around the table, how many pieces of pizza out of the 10 do you think a white person would get?
Well, to be, I personally have never exactly heard cause I've never really heard I have not heard much racism against white people.
Okay, so how many slices of pizza would they get?
To be honest, would think one, because
They would get a slice of pizza.
Yes, I think because, I'm definitely sure it's possible that there is racism against white people out there somewhere.
Okay, we'll talk about that. And so,
Because
how many?
I know they do it a lot to other people, but I'm pretty sure that people do it to them.
Okay, we'll talk about that. How many slices of pizza would the Asian person get? Now,
So when we have these discussions surrounding the nuances, I just wanted to show that piece to you so that you can actually see a young child processing information that can be complicated even for adults to get into. We don't have to have all the right answers. We just have to encourage them to engage in the dialogue such that they're able to really begin to develop out this framework of understanding who they are and how it works. And so before we get into the Q&A, I just want to give you a few tips on kind of the logistics of navigating these conversations. Number one, start early. You don't want to start having a difficult conversation for the very first time with your child when they're 16 or they're 14 years old. You want to model for them throughout their childhood that you are someone who's able to walk in and tolerate the anxiety associated with the difficult conversation, no matter how difficult it is. So the first thing is start early. The second thing is let your child lead in the same way that you just saw that I stated there, where I opened up the dialogue with what is it that you know about this topic matter? What is it that you understand to be true about this space? And so we want to be able to get their thoughts on these things, and we want to let them lead the conversation. The other part about letting them lead is that sometimes we do expose something that they may not have been ready for because we assumed that they knew. Now, the other piece is don't duck the difficult questions. We want to make sure that we dig in and we help them see that there is no question that is too hard for you to pay attention to or focus on. You want them to know that no matter, even if you don't have the answers to the question, you want to let them know that you're open to processing it, you're open to researching it, you're open to looking into it. Listen with your heart. Show empathy and understanding. Be able to put yourself in an emotional space where that child is engaging in this difficult conversation. Don't lie. Don't lie. If there are things you're not ready to share with them, if there are things that you don't think they should be exposed to yet, you can say that. But what we don't want to do is lie to our kids. There's too much information out there to make you believe that a lie that you tell your child cannot be unlearned or discovered across somewhere in the internet or around one of their friends or around another adult. Set the scene. choose somewhere that is calm and quiet. Turn the TV off. You may even want to like set up some juice or some snacks or something to demonstrate the safety of the space. Have a trial run if you need to. Talk to a friend. Practice. Practice if you need to. And remember, it's always okay to say, I'll get back to you. Let's circle back on that. Let dad kind of figure out what he even thinks about this, and I'll get back to you. Charlene, those are my last 3 points. I'm going to put them in the chat box as well, and I'm hoping we have some more questions that people want to know.
We have wonderful questions, Donald. I am
Great.
not surprised that this is a very thoughtful audience, and the questions are amazing. So let's see how we can do. And you know what you said about practicing? I was so proud of my adult son, who's now a dad and married. But when he was younger, communication was so important. In his 20s, he was breaking up with a young lady who he really had a lot of respect for, but he needed some help. So we actually role played that breakup before he talked.
Yes.
And it really worked.
Yes, of course it worked. Of course it worked. People minimize the impact of an actual kind of practice round. Like, you know, I have HR professionals who are executive coach all the time who say, hey, I got to let this person go. It's going to be a really tough termination. They're a single dad, blah, 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 blah. Can we walk through something? Every time. Role play, practice, you know, and you may be helping another parent figure it out when you role play with them and you guys practice together.
Mm-hmm. Really good point. So we're going to start off with just a comment because I really think it's very beautiful. Obey the law, we say, yet what if there is a law or pervasive religious belief that's against the kindness and inclusivity we want to instill in our child? For example, homosexuality is a sin. There's a law against transgender kids and gender identification surgeries. Thank you for this, very interesting and useful. So
I appreciate that comment. And, you know, one of the things I've responded to with that statement is that laws change, values don't. And so, there was a time in America where it was illegal to buy whiskey. Now it's one of the number one killers in the United States of America because it's so readily legal. And so, we have to pay attention to laws and really what they mean. And they change so frequently, but our values, our core values, they don't usually change. So if murder became legal tomorrow, most of us would not become murderers.
So speaking of values, this is a question I shared, Donald, if you would. Can you talk to us a little bit again about the identity piece, having some trouble understanding that?
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying, for asking that one. That's a big one to unpack. The identity piece is the driver of how we show up in the room, right? And so when we're having this difficult conversation, we're trying to figure out what we're saying, what that means about us, what that means about who we are as people, right? And so for instance, when we talk about an individual who is speaking about, in fact, let's say abortion, for instance. That's a big topic right now. A child comes to you because let's say they're 10 years old and they've seen on the news or they've seen on TV all these discussions about abortion. They already know what abortion is, but they don't understand why some people are for it and why some people are against it, right? Some people will automatically just go to religion and say, well, our faith says that that's something that our family values don't align with and don't support. And that's their kind of foundational way to say it. That person is using their identity as Christian or Jewish or Catholic as their primary identity to explain that component, right? Now, somebody else who is of that exact same religion may have had a different historical experience and they're having a tough time navigating their own identity. Maybe they're the survivor of a sexual assault for which they had to terminate a pregnancy. Maybe they're the adoptee of a parent who almost terminated the pregnancy. And so when I say identity, I'm saying that all of our lived experiences come into this conversation, and the anxiety associated with the conversation is how some of those identities that we may not be as proud of, that may not be as thought out, that may not be as secure, that may not be as stable, they all start popping up, and they all start informing how we move, how we behave, how we act. And that's the danger and the identity component of the conversation. A lot of work, I'm having this concern with a lot of workplaces now. I gave the example about microaggression earlier, and I hear people say, you know, I'm not racist. And I'm like, nobody's saying you're racist or sexist. They're just saying that you did something that was a microaggression. 30 years ago, you could walk around a meeting and men would just be putting their hands on women's shoulders as they walked around the office and just touching women in ways that they didn't think were inappropriate. But now women are like, dude, don't touch me. And then somebody says it and he's like, I'm not sexist. And it's like, nobody's saying you're sexist, sir. What we are saying is that you don't have the right to put your hand on her shoulder. It was just her shoulder. It doesn't matter. You're in her personal space. And that's his identity piece popping up, making it difficult for him to understand that he is engaging in an activity grounded in sexism that somebody doesn't want him to engage in.
Thank you, Donald. That really makes sense. It's who we are bringing as ourselves to the conversation.
And how that impacts the conversation.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for that. So here's a question I know is kind of on everybody's mind. It's a good one. Question is, how do we talk to high school age teens about the underlying causes of major wars without taking sides?
That's a great question. I've been doing this across the country literally for the last 3 or 4 months, traveling to my different clients, helping these organizations understand about response and all these things. My first thought is gaining an understanding of history ourselves. I'm not suggesting that anybody needs to go get a PhD in Middle Eastern history. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. What I am saying is that when we talk about issues surrounding justice, we have to remember our kids have access to way more information than we've ever had access to. Part of our problem as adults, particularly with this specific situation, is that we've gotten a very narrow lens of what that region has endured over the last 50 years. And looking at those things, we become unable sometimes to be Switzerland. We end up, because of the information shared, because of what we've seen, we end up on one side. And so for me, I think it's important that you, again, ask your teen, ask your high schooler what they know. Talk to them about what they've seen, and then you do some digging in your own due diligence and learn different components of this. I feel like there's often more than one perspective when we're talking about international relationships. And when we look at this specific instance, 20 years ago, we were not able to discuss the humanitarian crisis happening in Gaza. Today, we're able now in a more effective way, because our news outlets are more balanced and people are raising concerns about it. We're able to see that we have concerns coming from both sides as it relates to this current war. And how do you have that conversation with your child to understand that, and this for me is the foundation of it, that it is possible that two very different thoughts can be true at the exact same time.
And you can say that to your child. Yes, Donald?
Absolutely. Two different ideas can be true at the same time. I can be against abortion and understand that if a 9-year-old girl gets raped, that can be a problem. I can have both of those truths at the exact same time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. Here's a question that I think probably is true for a lot of families. Question is, how can I start a conversation with my child who is not motivated to try new things or talk with new people to make friends, or feels excluded in their current situation at school. You know that kind of kid.
I do. And, I oftentimes think when I used to practice clinically, I used to think about that a lot because, it was this kind of feedback loop where the child felt isolated and then they ended up becoming actually isolated because of their feelings of isolation. And it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. I think that we have to first work with our kids surrounding tools to temper and taper anxiety. Kids right now, because of all the exposure to all the things, social media, the 24-hour news cycle, school, IB classes, and AP courses, the pressures are unlike they've ever been before. And so I think the first thing we have to honestly do is to tool our kids up with self-care tools in the way that we weren't tooled up as kids. I think that we should all be teaching our children breathing exercises and doing them with them. We should be doing meditation with our children. Again, I know you can't do this every day, but certainly we can all find 20 minutes to collectively meditate with whatever our home structure looks like. So first thing is we want to give our kids tools to be able to manage anxiety. We also then want to be able to practice and create safe spaces for them when they are experiencing anxiety. So maybe it is required for us to set up a time where we meet this other kid at Barnes and Nobles, and it's a group thing where the families and the parents are there and we're connecting with one another. And then that child gets what we call a corrective emotional experience. Because typically kids who self-isolate, I'm not diagnosing anyone here, but absent some pervasive developmental disorder or an underlying mental health concern, oftentimes they're isolating because they're unsatisfied with how they've experienced those relationships in the past. So they're just like, forget it. I'm just going to sit back here and just do me all the time. And you're like, oh, you can't do that because that's dangerous. And so what we want to do is provide them with opportunities to see that there can be safety in these new experiences. And we're going to do little by little by little to show you that. Kind of like somebody who's afraid of a spider, right? They go and they get exposure therapy. Here's a picture of a spider. Here's a fake spider. Here's a spider in a jar. Here's a spider outside of a jar. And we're slowly helping them see these things and get exposed and understand them better to feel more safe.
So, Donald, this has really been such a practical and compassionate hour together.
I didn't know we were at time already.
We are, and we are so grateful to you. But I want to give you one last minute just for your parting thoughts for today. But thank you, everybody. The comments, the audience, you've been wonderful. You've been so grateful for Dr. Grant's wisdom, and it's really empathy and compassion that you bring. Look at this, isn't this great?
I appreciate that. I'm just so my closing words. Oh, those are beautiful. My closing words are that grace is key to parenting. You have to remember, as you are a parent walking through this space parenting, you're still a person walking through this place as a human being, and we're being impacted by all these things. And so provide yourself with some grace and deliberately move into these areas that you're afraid of. Remember, a part of the reason why we disconnect from our kids is because we're afraid to have some of these conversations. We're afraid to do some of this stuff. Give yourself some grace, but get going. Get going. You got to do it. And it's not going to be as difficult as you think it is.
Those are wonderful last words. Grace and get going. Look at that.
Get going.
We agree. So, Dr. Donald Grant, thank you again for your wisdom and brilliance and compassion and warmth. We just really appreciate you. And this was a great session today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Glad to have you with us. Hope to see you again soon. Good night.